He was a single father and brought flowers to his wife's grave every week. But one day the flowers started disappearing. He set up a camera to catch the vandals, and what he saw at night broke his heart. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The alarm clock rang before dawn, filling the small house with its shrill and unwelcome cry. Mark Hayden reached out from the warmth of his worn quilt and silenced it with a heavy hand. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling as the early morning chill crept through the cracks in the window frame. The house was always colder since she had gone. He pushed the thought away as he did every morning, swung his legs over the edge of the bed, and let his feet find the familiar grooves in the wooden floorboards. His back ached when he straightened, a deep, grinding pain that reminded him he had worked too many years with a shovel, too many days carrying weight meant for younger men. He dressed quietly so as not to wake his son, pulling on faded work jeans and a flannel shirt with frayed cuffs. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee in the dented old percolator and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the world was still dark. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock were the only sounds. On the counter sat a small bundle of flowers he had bought the night before, wrapped in cheap brown paper. Beside them lay a folded piece of paper, a drawing his son had made of his mother, stick-thin but smiling, with long hair and a bright yellow dress. Danny padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up in every direction. He was small for his age, but there was a quiet sturdiness about him that made Mark proud. He did not complain about the early hour or about their weekly ritual, even though most boys his age would have preferred to sleep in. He sat down at the table, pulled the drawing toward himself, and smoothed the creases with his palm as if to make sure it looked perfect. They ate in silence, a simple breakfast of toast and eggs. It was not the silence of anger or distance, but of two people who had learned to live in the wake of grief. Words seemed too heavy in the mornings, and besides, both of them knew what the day held. After they finished, Mark packed the flowers carefully, making sure the stems would not bend, and Danny tucked the drawing under his arm. They put on their jackets, his old and patched. Danny slightly too big, a hand-me-down from a neighbor, and stepped out into the gray light of dawn. The road to the cemetery was quiet at that hour. The houses on their street still slept, windows dark, curtains drawn. Mark's old pickup groaned when he started it, coughing before settling into a steady rumble. They drove in silence, the heater blowing lukewarm air, the smell of old leather filling the cab. The town passed by in slow procession, shuttered shops, a gas station, a diner with lights just beginning to glow. The sky brightened gradually, streaked with pale pink and gold. The cemetery sat on a low hill at the edge of town, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that creaked when Mark pushed the gate open. The gravel path crunched under their boots as they walked between the rows of headstones. It was always quiet here, as though the whole world held its breath out of respect for the dead. Mark's chest tightened, as it always did, when they came to the white marble cross, with her name carved deep into it. He knelt first, laying the flowers at the base of the stone with deliberate care. The ground was damp, the smell of earth strong in the cool morning air. Danny stood beside him, clutching the drawing in both hands before finally setting it down, weighted with a small stone so the wind would not take it. Mark rested his hand against the cold marble, closed his eyes and let memories flood him. He saw her face as she had been in life, smiling in the kitchen as she stirred a pot on the stove, brushing hair out of her eyes with the back of her hand. He heard her laugh, the sound that had once filled this world with warmth. They stayed like that for some time, father and son, bound in silence, speaking only in the quiet language of memory. When Mark finally rose, he brushed the dirt from his knees, his movements slow, heavy. The drive back home was quiet, but lighter somehow, as though leaving something behind at the grave allowed them both to breathe a little easier. This was their life, week after week, a ritual carved into the shape of their days. Mark worked long hours at the construction site, his body enduring the heat, the cold, the back-breaking labor, so there would be food on the table and clothes on Danny's back. In the evenings they ate together, did homework together, sometimes watched television in the dim glow of the living room lamp. The house was small, but it was clean, and though it carried the weight of absence, it was not without love. Yet grief had a way of settling in like dust, clinging to every corner. Mark felt it most on the nights when the house was too quiet, when he caught sight of her photograph on the wall and remembered the life they used to have. He tried to keep that sorrow from Danny, tried to be strong, but there were moments when the boy would catch him staring into space, lost in thought, and he would look away quickly, ashamed. It was on one of those gray mornings, several weeks later, that they found the first sign something was wrong. They walked the familiar path to the grave, the crunch of gravel almost comforting, and stopped short. The flowers they had placed the previous week were gone, not wilted, not scattered by the wind, gone as though they had never been there. Mark frowned, puzzled. Perhaps the groundskeeper had cleared them away, though he usually left offerings until they decayed. He told himself it was nothing and laid a new bouquet at the foot of the cross. But the following week, the same thing happened again. This time, not only were the flowers missing, but the drawing Danny had left had disappeared as well. The boy stood staring at the bare earth, his small face confused, hurt. Mark felt heat rise in his chest, a slow-burning anger he did not want to feel but could not stop. Someone had taken what belonged to them, what was meant for her. The weeks passed, and the pattern continued. Each time they came, whatever they had left was gone. Mark began to notice faint disturbances in the soil, footprints perhaps, though the rain often blurred them. A gnawing unease took root in him. At night, lying awake in the dark, he imagined strangers coming in the night, trampling over her resting place, stealing the small tokens of remembrance. The thought made his hands clench into fists. He said nothing to Danny, not wanting to frighten him, but the boy sensed the change. He watched his father's jaw tighten, saw the way his shoulders hunched when they approached the grave. Their weekly visits, once quiet moments of connection, became charged with tension. Mark began to linger longer after placing the flowers, scanning the ground for signs, listening for any sound. One evening, after another long day at work, Mark sat at the kitchen table long after Danny had gone to bed. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock. The anger that had been simmering in him now felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He could not go on like this, he told himself. He had to know who was doing this, who was disturbing the last place where he felt close to her. The thought frightened him, for it meant stepping beyond the boundary of his grief, turning his mourning into action. But the decision, once formed, would not let him rest. By the time the clock struck midnight, Mark knew what he had to do. The decision that had been taking shape in Mark's mind during those long, silent nights solidified with the weight of inevitability. He could no longer tolerate the unanswered questions that haunted him every time he stood before the grave and saw the earth bare, the flowers missing, the offerings vanished. His grief had been heavy enough, but this violation, real or imagined, made it unbearable. He spent the next day moving through his work on the construction site like a man on autopilot, his hands laying bricks, mixing mortar, hammering boards, but his mind fixed on a single thought. He had to find out who was coming to the grave when he was not there. That evening, after Danny had finished his homework and gone to his room, Mark took a seat at the kitchen table and stared at the phone for a long time before picking it up. He called a man he had not spoken to in years, an old co-worker from his younger days who now owned a small electronics shop on the far end of town. The conversation was short, awkward, as though the years of silence lay like dust between them. But Mark's voice was steady. He asked for something small, something discreet, something that could watch when he could not. The man didn't press him for details, only said he might have what Mark needed. The next day after work, Mark drove across town to the shop. The bell above the door jingled when he stepped inside, and the smell of dust and warm plastic hit him. Shelves lined with cables, batteries, and blinking gadgets gave the place a cluttered, almost claustrophobic feeling. The man behind the counter greeted him with a nod, disappearing into the back room before returning with a small box. Inside lay a tiny camera, no larger than a matchbox, with a rechargeable battery and a lens that could capture hours of footage even in low light. Mark held it in his calloused hands as if it were something fragile, an object that carried more weight than its size should allow. He paid in cash, thanked the man with a short nod, and left. All the way home, the box sat on the passenger seat, staring at him. By the time he pulled into the driveway, night had begun to fall, painting the sky in deep purples and orange streaks. The house was warm and smelled of the stew he had put on earlier, but Mark barely tasted his dinner. Afterward, he sat at the table, the box unopened in front of him, his heart heavy. Installing a camera at the grave felt wrong, intrusive, almost like defiling the sanctity of that space. He could almost hear his wife's voice in his mind, asking him why he would bring such a cold, mechanical thing into a place meant for memory and love. Yet when he pictured Danny's face, the way the boy had stood confused and hurt when he saw the bare earth where his gift should have been, Mark's resolve hardened. He had promised his wife he would protect their son and everything that mattered to him, and now that promise extended to the memory of her resting place. The camera, small and unassuming, was no longer just a piece of technology. It was his one chance to reclaim control, to defend what had been taken. That night, after Danny had gone to bed, Mark opened the box, read the instructions under the dim kitchen light, and charged the battery. He checked the footage on the tiny screen, adjusted the angle, and tested it until he was sure it would capture what it needed to capture. The house was silent around him, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder than ever. When the battery was fully charged, he placed the camera carefully in his jacket pocket. The following evening, he told Danny to get his jacket, that they were going to the cemetery. The boy did not ask why, sensing the seriousness in his father's voice. They drove through the quiet streets, the headlights of the pickup cutting through the early night. The air had turned cold, and a fine mist hung over the fields outside of town, silver in the glow of the moon. The cemetery was nearly empty at that hour, the gate creaking softly when Mark pushed it open. They walked the path slowly, the gravel crunching under their feet, the headstones casting long, thin shadows in the moonlight. When they reached the grave, Mark knelt, brushing leaves from the base of the cross, his hands moving with quiet reverence. He placed the flowers as he always did, but then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the camera. Danny watched silently as his father dug a small hollow in the soft earth among the nearby shrubs, careful not to disturb the grave itself, and set the camera in place. He covered it with a thin layer of soil and leaves until it was nearly invisible. For a moment, Mark remained kneeling, his head bowed. He spoke softly under his breath. Words not meant for Danny's ears. He told her he was sorry, that what he was doing was not meant to desecrate her memory, but to protect it. He asked her forgiveness, his throat tightening, his hands trembling slightly. When he finished, he rose and stood in silence beside his son, staring down at the grave. The night was still around them, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the fence, the only break in the quiet. They walked back to the truck slowly. The air felt colder now, heavier. When they reached the house, Danny went to bed, but Mark sat awake long into the night at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. For the first time in months, he felt something stir inside him. Not relief, not peace, but a grim anticipation. He had done something, taken a step toward ending the torment of uncertainty. All that remained was to wait. The next days were an exercise in patience, and Mark was not a patient man. At work, he found himself distracted, his mind replaying the image of the camera hidden in the soil, imagining it recording the silent hours of the night. Each evening after he and Danny visited the grave and returned home, he resisted the temptation to check the footage right away, telling himself he should wait a few days to gather more than a single night's view. But every night, as he sat alone after Danny had gone to sleep, the urge to know gnawed at him like hunger. On the fifth night, he gave in. He connected the small device to his laptop, his hands rough and clumsy with tension. The first hours were uneventful, just static night sounds, branches swaying, a moth fluttering across the lens. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting, his heart thudding dully. And then it happened, a flicker of movement on the edge of the frame. He froze, his breath caught. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, faint at first, then clearer as they drew closer. Figures, small and thin, stepping carefully between the graves. There were 4, perhaps 5 of them, moving in silence. Their clothes were ragged, layers of fabric that hung loosely from their narrow shoulders. Their steps hesitant, almost reverent. They looked like children. Mark's chest tightened painfully. He had expected teenagers with cruel laughter, vandals with spray paint, or worse. The kind of people who came to cemeteries to do harm. But these were not predators. They were small and fragile, their faces pale in the dim glow. One boy knelt first at the grave, brushing his fingers lightly across the mound of earth as though in greeting. A girl reached for the toy Danny had left the previous week, clutching it to her chest with both hands, not with the glee of theft, but with something that looked almost like sorrow. Mark leaned closer to the screen, his hand trembling on the table. The children stayed there for a long time, not speaking, just standing together in the silence. Then the boy picked up the flowers, looked at them for a moment, and tucked a folded piece of paper against the base of the cross before standing and stepping back. The group lingered a moment longer, then slipped away into the night as quietly as they had come. When the screen returned to stillness, Mark sat back slowly, his breath uneven. His heart pounded in his chest, his body tense as though bracing for a blow. He watched the recording again, then a third time, unable to look away. Each viewing deepened his confusion. There was no malice in their movements, no cruelty. What he had seen was not desecration, but something else entirely, something he could not yet name. He closed the laptop and sat in silence, his elbows resting on the table, his face in his hands. He had sought the truth, and he had found it, but it was not the truth he had prepared himself for. The anger that had burned in him for weeks was suddenly hollow. In its place grew something heavier, a sorrow that spread through his chest until he thought it might crush him. These were children. They were hungry, homeless perhaps, and they had come not to destroy, but to seek something they lacked in the world outside. Comfort, beauty, a touch of love left behind by strangers. Mark sat there until the first light of dawn crept through the window, the house silent around him. He could not escape the image of the boy kneeling, the girl clutching the toy as if it were salvation. His grief had been a private thing, a fortress he had built around his heart, but now it had been breached, invaded not by cruelty, but by need. He rose from the table slowly, feeling as though the weight of the night had settled into his bones. The questions that had haunted him for months were answered, but their answer had opened a deeper conflict. He could no longer pretend this was a simple violation, an offense that could be corrected by anger. What he had seen required something else from him, something far more difficult. And though he did not yet know what he would do, he knew that the days ahead would not be the same as those that had come before. Morning came slowly, pale light creeping across the kitchen floorboards where Mark still sat, hunched over the table as though the weight of the night had pinned him there. His eyes were raw from lack of sleep, his mind filled with the images he could not escape. The boy kneeling by the grave, the girl pressing the toy to her chest, the silent exchange beneath the moonlight. They replayed over and over, a loop he could not break. When Danny came into the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes, Mark forced himself to straighten, to act as though the world was as it had always been, though inside he felt hollowed out. The day passed like a haze. At the construction site, Mark went through the motions of his work, his body moving by habit but his mind elsewhere. The sound of hammers and saws, the shouted instructions of his foreman, all faded into a dull backdrop as his thoughts circled endlessly. He had gotten what he wanted, the truth, but it had brought him no peace. If anything, it had deepened his torment. The anger that had once felt so sharp had dulled, replaced by something heavier, something he could not simply vent or shake off. When evening came, he returned home exhausted, but not from labor. He sat at the table long after dinner, his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the wood grain as though it might offer an answer. The camera sat beside him, silent now, a reminder of what it had shown him. He could feel Danny's eyes on him, the boy sensing the tension that lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. When Danny asked timidly whether they would go to the cemetery in the morning as usual, Mark only nodded, his voice too tight to speak. That night, sleep would not come. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing against him like a physical weight. Memories of his wife rose unbidden, her laughter, the warmth of her hands, the sound of her voice as she read to Danny when he was small. She had been the gentle one, the one who believed in mercy even when life had been cruel to her. He remembered how she used to volunteer at the shelter downtown, bringing warm meals and clothes to children whose faces still haunted him sometimes. She had insisted that kindness was never wasted, even when the world seemed undeserving. Would she have wanted him to drive those children away? The thought made his chest ache. He pictured her disapproving look, soft but steady, the way she would have said his name when she thought he was being too harsh. He turned over in bed, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes, but the images would not leave him. The girl's thin arms, the boy's bowed head, they were burned into his vision as surely as his wife's last smile had been. When dawn came, Mark rose early, made breakfast in silence, and loaded the flowers into the truck. Danny sat quietly beside him as they drove to the cemetery, sensing the gravity that hung over his father like a storm cloud. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with gray, and the wind carried the sharp scent of wet earth. When they reached the grave, Mark knelt as he always did, placing the flowers carefully. His hands moved slower this time, lingering on the stems, as though reluctant to let them go. Then he saw it. Resting at the base of the cross, half tucked under a stone, was a scrap of paper, folded and spotted with dew. His heart pounded as he reached for it, his fingers trembling. When he unfolded it, he saw only 2 words written in a child's uneven hand. "Thank you." The paper blurred as tears filled his eyes. He closed them, clutching the note in his fist, and felt something inside him break and heal all at once. The children had not only taken, they had understood. They had received what was left for them with gratitude. Danny stood beside him, looking up at his father's face, and though the boy said nothing, his expression told Mark he felt it too. Driving home, Mark's mind was no longer a storm of anger, but a tangle of questions and resolve. He could not go on as before, pretending this was a simple violation. The note had changed everything. It had transformed the act from theft into something almost sacred, a silent conversation between grief and need. That evening, instead of sitting brooding at the table, Mark went to the closet where old boxes were stacked on the shelves. He opened them one by one, pulling out the small treasures that had once belonged to Danny when he was younger. Shirts that no longer fit, shoes that had been outgrown, toys that had been tucked away. Dust rose into the air, carrying with it the ghosts of years gone by. Danny joined him, kneeling on the floor, looking through the boxes. His small hands lifted a toy truck, its paint chipped but still bright, and he held it thoughtfully before nodding. "This one," he seemed to say without words. One by one they chose, setting aside what they could bear to part with, building a pile that grew steadily as the evening passed. When they finished, Mark packed everything into a large canvas bag, the clothes, the toys, a few canned goods from the pantry. He added a loaf of bread he had baked the night before, still soft inside, and a couple of bottles of water. It felt strange, almost ceremonial, to prepare these things, as though he were packing for a journey that was not his own. The next morning they drove to the cemetery again. This time there was no heaviness in Mark's step, only a quiet determination. At the grave he laid the flowers as always, but then he set the bag carefully at the base of the cross, arranging it so the children would see it when they came. He lingered for a moment, his hand resting on the marble, and whispered under his breath. He told her this was for her, that through her he would try to make something good come from their pain. When they walked away, Mark turned back several times, his eyes on the small bundle that now sat like an offering. There was fear in him, fear that he was doing something wrong, that he was giving away what should belong only to his wife's memory. But alongside the fear was something new, a faint warmth that spread through him like the first hint of spring after a long winter. That night he lay awake again, but this time the darkness did not press so heavily. He pictured the children finding the bag, imagined their thin hands pulling out the toys, the food, the clothes. He saw them huddled together, sharing the bread, wrapping themselves in the warmth of something that had once been his son's. And for the first time since the funeral, the thought of the grave did not fill him only with pain. The following day when they returned, the bag was gone. In its place lay another piece of paper, this one with a small, rough drawing of a house, smoke curling from the chimney, flowers blooming outside. It was crude, the work of a child, but to Mark it was as precious as any masterpiece. He held it for a long time before slipping it carefully into his pocket. In the days that followed, the ritual grew. Each time they came, Mark brought something new. Bread, jars of soup, a few more toys. Each time the children left something behind. A bracelet woven from bits of string, a feather tied with a strip of cloth, another note scrawled with shaky words of thanks. Mark felt the change in himself as surely as if someone had lifted a weight from his back. His grief had not gone, but it had shifted, reshaped itself into something that no longer crushed him, but propelled him forward. Each offering he left at the grave felt like an act of defiance against despair, a way to turn loss into life. Danny, too, seemed different. The sadness that had once dulled his eyes began to ease, replaced by a quiet pride. He asked to help more, gathering the toys, choosing which clothes to bring, even adding his own small drawings to the bundle. Together, father and son had begun to transform the grave from a place of mourning into a place of mercy. And yet, late at night, when the house was still, Mark sometimes found himself pacing the floor, questioning whether he was doing the right thing. Was he honoring her memory or giving it away? Was he protecting the sanctity of her resting place or turning it into something else entirely? The questions gnawed at him, but when he looked at the small tokens the children left behind, he felt a kind of peace. He would sit at the table, the latest drawing or note before him, and think of his wife. He imagined her smile, imagined her voice saying she was proud of him. It was this thought, more than anything, that allowed him to keep going, to silence the doubts when they grew too loud. By the end of that month, the grave no longer seemed to Mark like a place of death. It had become something living, something that connected him and Danny to the quiet figures who came in the night. The flowers he placed were still for her, but now they were also for them, a sign that they were seen, that they were not alone. Mark did not know what would come next. He only knew that the path they had begun could not be abandoned. The boy in the video, the girl clutching the toy, they were no longer just strangers in the night. They were a part of the story now, as much as the grief, as much as the love. And as he prepared the next bundle to take to the cemetery, Mark felt something he had not felt in a long time. Purpose. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Keep watching. There's another powerful story waiting for you right here. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.